In the small town of Asheville, North Carolina, lived a young man named Michael. Since childhood, he had been deeply passionate about music. His fingers danced over the guitar strings with a natural grace that moved those who listened. However, Michael carried a shadow that grew within him day by day. No matter where he went, his eyes only saw the brilliance of others, never his own. When he watched Ryan play the piano at the local conservatory, his heart sank. Why do I sound so amateur while he plays as if he was born with the keys under his fingers? At the symphony concerts, hearing Emily's violin, he thought, I will never be able to express so much emotion through my music. And when he saw David composing his own songs, while he still struggled to interpret others' work, Michael felt as if an insurmountable mountain stood before him. This constant comparison took deep root in his mind. Slowly, Michael started skipping his music classes. His guitar, once his inseparable companion, now sat gathering dust in the corner of his room. Every note he tried to play seemed to mock his imagined incompetence. The joy that music once brought him was now replaced by paralyzing anxiety. Why should I keep going if I will never be as good as them? This question echoed in his mind like a melancholic melody that refused to end. Worried about seeing her son abandon his passion, his mother suggested he visit Mrs. Celia, an old music teacher who lived on a hilltop. Known not only for her musical talent but also for her wisdom, Celia rarely took students, preferring the solitude of her home filled with instruments. At first, Michael resisted. What could she possibly tell me that would change anything? But eventually he gave into his mother's persistent requests. One afternoon, he made the decision to go see Mrs. Celia. Mrs. Celia was not what Michael expected. At 78 years old, her arthritic fingers seemed incapable of producing a single note from an instrument. Seated in a simple chair on the porch, she watched Michael approach with sharp eyes that contrasted with her frail body. "You must be Linda's son," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Your mother called to let me know you were coming." Michael nodded, feeling uneasy. Mrs. Celia's house was modest, lacking the grandeur he had imagined for someone who, according to his mother, had once performed in great orchestras. The walls were lined with black and white photographs of a younger Celia standing alongside musicians he recognized from music history books. "She told me you've given up on music," Celia continued, motioning for him to sit. "Is that true?" "I haven't given up," Michael replied defensively. "I just realized I don't have the same talent as other musicians." Celia studied him for a moment before responding. "Did you bring your guitar?" Michael shook his head. He hadn't played in weeks. "Then how do you expect me to help you?" she asked, with a bluntness that caught him off guard. "Honestly, I don't expect you to," he admitted. "I came because my mother insisted." Celia smiled, unbothered by his sincerity. "Do you know why I stopped teaching at the conservatory?" she asked. Michael shook his head. "Because I got tired of watching talented young people destroy their potential by spending too much time looking over their neighbor's fence." Her words struck Michael like a slap. That was exactly what he had been doing. "Come with me," she said, rising slowly with some difficulty. Michael followed her inside the house, where a spacious room housed various instruments: an old piano, several violins, a cello, and at least 3 guitars of different styles. Mrs. Celia walked over to a bookshelf and pulled out a folder filled with yellowed sheet music. Her movements were slow but precise. She opened the folder on a table, revealing concert programs, newspaper reviews, and more photographs. "Here," she pointed to a picture of her younger self, standing beside a man holding a guitar. This was Andres Segovia, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. "I was his student for years." She flipped through a few pages and showed another photo. "And here I am with John Williams after a masterclass in London." She continued, showing more pictures and newspaper clippings, unfolding before Michael the history of an impressive career. "What do you see in these photos?" she finally asked. "A great musician," he replied, genuinely impressed. "Wrong," Celia corrected him. "What you see is the final result of thousands of hours of practice, doubts, tears, and most importantly, failures. What you don't see are the countless times I wanted to give up." Celia closed the folder of memories and led Michael to the open window overlooking the garden behind the house. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and birds sang in the distance. "Listen," she said. Michael remained silent, confused. What was he supposed to hear? "The garden," Celia explained, "is like a natural orchestra. Can you hear it?" Michael focused. There was the chirping of different birds, the whisper of the wind. Through the trees, the distant hum of bees, and even the faint sound of running water somewhere. "Now tell me," Celia continued, "does the sparrow feel sad because it cannot sing like the nightingale? Does the oak tree feel like a failure because it doesn't bear fruit like the apple tree? Does the creek resent not having the grandeur of the river that runs through the valley?" Michael remained silent, beginning to grasp her point. "Every element in this garden has its own voice, its own rhythm, its own purpose," she explained, "and it is precisely their differences that create the harmony we hear. If all the birds sang the same, if all the plants were identical, wouldn't it be monotonous?" She turned to him, her gaze intense. "Music works the same way. Do you have any idea how many guitarists I knew who were technically flawless but moved no one? Or pianists who could play the most difficult pieces but without soul? Every musician has their own voice, Michael." She pointed to the instruments in the room. "Come here," she said, walking toward the back of the room, where 3 guitars rested on stands. "These are different types of guitars I've collected over the years." She picked up the first one, a classical guitar with nylon strings. "This is a José Ramirez from Spain, perfect for classical music." She ran her hand over the polished wood. "It has a warm, deep tone, ideal for Bach or Villalobos." Then she showed him another guitar, simpler in appearance. "This one is a Brazilian guitar, custom made for me by a luthier from São Paulo. Perfect for choro and bossa nova, it has a brighter projection." Finally, she pointed to a steel string guitar with a larger body. "And this is a Martin, an American guitar ideal for folk and country music." She looked at Michael, who observed the instruments with renewed interest. "If I tried to play country music on this classical guitar, it wouldn't sound right. If I used the Martin for Bach, the result would be strange. Each instrument has its purpose, its unique voice." Michael nodded, beginning to understand. "Now," she continued, "imagine if this Ramirez started comparing itself to the Martin, lamenting that it couldn't produce the same volume or brightness. Or if the Brazilian guitar felt inferior for not having the famous name of the other two. That would be absurd," Michael replied. "Each one has its own unique qualities." "Exactly," Celia agreed. "The same logic applies to us as musicians. Ryan, Emily, David, they all have their own musical voices shaped over years. And you do too, Michael. But you'll never find yours if you spend all your time trying to sound like someone else." The idea struck Michael like a revelation. He had never thought of it that way. He had always seen other musicians as points on a single linear scale where he was always falling behind. "It's not about being better or worse than others," Celia continued. "It's about finding your own voice, your own expression. And that only happens when you stop comparing yourself and start listening to yourself." Celia walked over to a small cabinet and pulled out a worn-out box. From inside, she took out an old cassette recorder and a few tapes. "Do you know what these are?" she asked, holding up the tapes for Michael to see. He shook his head. He had only seen recorders like that in old movies. "These are recordings of my practice sessions when I was about your age," she explained. "My teacher insisted that we record our rehearsals to listen back and analyze our mistakes." She placed one of the tapes in the recorder and pressed play. A crackling sound filled the room, followed by hesitant guitar notes. The playing was basic, with clear rhythm mistakes and missed notes. "This is me at 19 trying to play Villalobos's Prelude No. 1, she said with a smile. Michael was surprised. That recording showed no sign of the musician Celia would later become. She stopped the tape and inserted another. This time the same piece sounded cleaner, more confident, though still with small imperfections. 2 years later, she explained, after hundreds of hours of practice, she switched the tape again. Now the prelude sounded fluid, expressive, with an interpretation so rich that Michael closed his eyes to fully appreciate it. "A concert recording when I was 26, she said. 7 years after the first tape." Celia turned off the recorder and looked directly at Michael. "The musician you are today is not the musician you will be tomorrow. and certainly not the musician you will be in 10 years. Comparing yourself to others is not only unfair, it's completely pointless. She placed her hands on Michael's shoulders. Your fellow musicians are not your competitors. They are part of the same orchestra of life as you, each one contributing their own voice. The only valid comparison is between the musician you were yesterday and the one you are today. At that moment, something deep shifted within Michael. It was as if an out-of-tune string inside him finally found the right tension. All the comparisons he had made, all the times he had diminished himself in front of others, now it all seemed like such a waste of energy and time. "Can I play one of your guitars?" he asked suddenly. Celia smiled, pleased by the request. "Of course. Which one?" Michael looked at the three instruments and chose the Brazilian guitar, the one that didn't have the prestige of the Spanish guitar or the sturdiness of the American one, but that carried its own personality. As his fingers touched the strings, something different happened. For the first time in months, Michael wasn't thinking about how Ryan, Emily, or David would play. He was just listening to himself, feeling the vibration of the strings, the resonance of the wood, the melody that was born from his own hands. "I can hear your voice now," Celia said after a few minutes. "And it's unique." In the weeks that followed, Michael returned to Mrs. Celia's house many times. Not for formal lessons, she no longer gave those, but to talk and, most importantly, to play. With each visit, he brought his own guitar, which now rarely stayed in its case. He resumed his lessons at the conservatory, but with a completely different attitude. When he observed the other students, he no longer saw them as unreachable standards, but as musicians with their own journeys and voices. Following Celia's advice, Michael began recording his practice sessions. At first it was painful to hear his imperfections, but soon he realized the value of the exercise. He could track his own progress, day by day, week by week. The most surprising thing for him was discovering how different his style was from that of his peers. While Ryan excelled at complex and technically brilliant compositions, Michael found his strength in emotional simplicity, the ability to convey deep feeling even through the most basic melodies. 6 months after his first meeting with Celia, Michael was invited to perform at a recital at the conservatory. Instead of choosing a challenging classical piece to impress the audience, he decided to play an original composition, something he never would have considered before. On the night of the recital, as he stepped onto the small stage, he noticed Celia sitting discreetly in the last row. She had promised she would come, despite the difficulty of going out at night. Michael took a deep breath, introduced his piece, Dialogue Between Birds, inspired by the sounds in Celia's garden, and began to play. It wasn't a technically perfect performance. There were small mistakes that only he and perhaps the most experienced musicians noticed, but there was something far more important present: authenticity. When he finished, the applause was warm. Among the audience, he saw Ryan, the pianist he had once envied, clapping with genuine respect. Emily, the violinist, smiled approvingly, and David, the composer, gave him a thumbs up, recognizing the originality of his piece. After the recital, several fellow musicians approached him. "Your style is really interesting," Ryan commented. "It's unique, different from what we usually hear." "I loved how you captured the dialogue between the birds," Emily said. "It really felt like they were conversing." "Did you compose this?" David asked, genuinely surprised. "It's great. If you'd like, we can exchange some ideas on composition sometime." Michael thanked them, feeling neither superior nor inferior, just part of the same musical community, each contributing in their own way. When the hall emptied, he found Celia still sitting in her seat. "What did you think?" he asked, eager for his mentor's opinion. "I heard your voice," she said simply. "Clear and authentic." Michael smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. "You know what I liked most?" Celia continued. "Seeing how present you were in every note. You weren't trying to be anyone else. You were just being yourself." 2 years had passed. Michael had not become a world-famous virtuoso, nor was he the most technically skilled musician in Asheville. But he had found his path in music. He began teaching children, discovering a special talent for igniting a love of music in his students. His compositions, inspired by the sounds of nature and everyday experiences, gained a small but devoted audience. And every week, he continued visiting Mrs. Celia, who, now limited by old age, rarely left her home. During one of these visits, as he played a new composition for her, Michael noticed a special smile on Celia's face. "What is it?" he asked when he finished. "I was just thinking about how much you've grown since that day you arrived here, defeated by comparisons," she replied. "Do you know what the difference is between who you are now and who you were back then?" Michael reflected for a moment. "Back then I wanted to be everyone except myself," he said. "Now I understand that the only musician I can truly be is Michael." Celia nodded, pleased. "There's a phrase I've carried with me for decades," she said. "It was the best advice I ever received when I struggled with comparisons. In the orchestra of life, each person plays their own instrument. Listen to others, learn from them, but never abandon your sheet music because you wish you had theirs." Michael absorbed her words, realizing how perfectly they captured his journey. Years later, when Mrs. Celia was no longer among them, Michael became a teacher at the conservatory. In his first class, looking at the young musicians filled with insecurities and self-doubt, he decided to share the most valuable lesson he had ever learned. He took his students to the school's garden, asked them to close their eyes and listen. Then he told them the story of the guitars, the story of the orchestra of nature, and finally he left them with the message that had transformed his life. Don't compare yourself to anyone. Every musician plays their own melody. The world doesn't need copies. It needs the unique music that only you can create. Have you ever felt like Michael, lost in comparisons with others? We've all been there at some point. If this story resonated with you or gave you a new perspective on your own journey, don't keep this reflection to yourself. Subscribe to the channel now to receive more inspiring stories like this every week. With just one click on the red button below, you ensure that messages of wisdom like this reach you regularly. And don't miss the next video appearing on your screen right now. In it, we'll explore how to find your true calling, even when everyone around you seems to be following a different path. Remember, the world doesn't need copies. It needs the unique music that only you can create. See you in the next video.